Jake Mitchell had always lived by a simple philosophy: live and let live. His farm, a sprawling piece of land passed down through generations, was more than just a source of income. It was a legacy, a living tribute to the hard work and resilience of his ancestors. Every morning, Jake would wake up to the golden field stretching out before him, the scent of fresh soil, and the comforting sounds of animals beginning their day. That was all the peace he ever needed. But that peace was about to be shattered by a force more persistent than any drought or storm: Karen Whitmore. Karen was the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association in a nearby suburban development that had sprung up about 5 years earlier. With an overinflated sense of authority, an obsession with rigid rules, and zero tolerance for anything outside her idealized vision of community living, she had already built a reputation for enforcing rules no one remembered agreeing to. Her latest obsession, however, was Jake's farm. Although it sat just outside the HOA's official boundary, the mere sight of his barn, his animals, and even his unpaved driveway seemed to offend her to the core. The first time Karen showed up on Jake's property, it was with the energy of someone who'd just been personally insulted. Wearing a perfectly pressed beige pantsuit and gripping a clipboard like it was a sword, she marched up to his porch like a woman who always got her way. Jake, who was enjoying his morning coffee on the porch, watched her approach with mild amusement. "You must be Mr. Mitchell," she said briskly, sounding more like a salesperson than a neighbor. Jake leaned back in his chair and took a long sip of coffee. "That's me. I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Crestwood Estates Homeowners Association. I'd like to have a little chat about your property." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Didn't realize I had anything to do with Crestwood Estates." Karen's smile was tight. "Technically, you don't. But your farm borders our community, and as I'm sure you understand, property values are a delicate matter." Jake set his mug down, watching her as she continued. "We've received several complaints about your operations. The noise, the smell, and frankly, the visual impact on the neighborhood. We have a certain aesthetic standard we like to maintain, and we believe your farm would benefit from a few adjustments." Jake let out a small laugh. "Adjustments? For starters," she said, "that large red barn is quite the eyesore. Perhaps repaint it in a more neutral tone, or better yet, consider downsizing. And then there's the matter of your rooster. Several residents have complained about being woken up before sunrise. It's quite disruptive." Jake studied her, trying to figure out if she was actually serious. That barn had stood there for nearly 60 years, its red color practically a landmark. As for the rooster, well, that was just nature doing what nature does. "So let me get this straight," he said, rubbing his chin. "You want me to repaint my barn and somehow convince a rooster to hit the snooze button because your residents don't like the sound of the countryside?" Karen's smile remained frozen, but her eyes flashed with irritation. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand that change can be hard. But this is in everyone's best interest. I'd hate for this to become a more complicated issue." Jake stood and stretched. "Miss Whitmore, I appreciate you stopping by. But my farm isn't part of your HOA. I don't answer to your rules. As far as I can tell, my land, my barn, and my animals aren't bothering anyone." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll see about that," she muttered, before spinning on her heel and storming back to her SUV. Jake watched her leave, shaking his head. He'd dealt with stubborn animals before, but he had a feeling Karen was going to be a whole different breed of trouble. And he was right. The trouble started almost immediately after that visit. First came the letters, official notices printed on HOA letterhead, demanding that he comply with neighborhood regulations. This despite the fact that his farm lay entirely outside their jurisdiction. Then came the complaints, calls to the county, reporting alleged code violations. None of them had any legal weight, but that didn't stop her. Jake tried to ignore it until Karen showed up again, this time with two equally smug HOA board members flanking her. "You again," Jake said, wiping his hands on a rag as he stepped away from fixing a fence. "Mr. Mitchell," Karen greeted with an exaggerated sigh, as though this whole thing was an unfortunate burden she hadn't asked for. "I was hoping we could resolve this civilly. But you continue to ignore our requests." Jake crossed his arms. "That's because your requests are ridiculous." Karen, unfazed, handed him another paper. "As per HOA regulations, I'm not in your HOA," Jake interrupted, waving the document back at her. Karen continued as if he hadn't spoken. "As per HOA regulations, all properties within visual range of Crestwood Estates must adhere to our community aesthetic guidelines. We are prepared to take further action if necessary." Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "Lady, you're not my landlord. You don't have any authority here." Karen's expression didn't change, but one of the board members, a wiry man with thick glasses, stepped forward. "We've been in contact with county officials about zoning laws. If your farm is found to be in violation, you could be subject to fines." Jake's amusement began to fade. He knew his farm was fully compliant with agricultural zoning. But he also knew people like Karen, relentless, entitled, and always looking for a way to win. They'd dig and dig until they found something to make his life miserable. "Well, you go ahead and do what you feel you need to do," Jake said, stepping closer. "But if you, or anyone from your HOA, sets foot on my land again, I'll be calling the sheriff for trespassing." For the first time, Karen's expression cracked. A flicker of frustration crossed her face before she quickly composed herself. "You're making this far more difficult than it needs to be," she snapped. "No," Jake replied, his voice calm and steady. "I think you are." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Karen and her entourage standing speechless on the path. He could almost hear her teeth grinding as she huffed and stomped back to her SUV. That should have been the end of it. But Jake was about to learn the hard way. Karen wasn't the kind of person who accepted no for an answer. She had declared war, and she wasn't backing down. The first sign that things were escalating came the next morning. Jake found an envelope tucked into his mailbox, delivered under the cover of night. It looked official, with the HOA's smug logo stamped in the top left corner. He smirked. They really thought a fancy letterhead would intimidate him? Inside was a list of so-called violations his farm was supposedly committing, each one more ridiculous than the last. Unapproved exterior color. Apparently, the red barn clashed with the neighborhood's visual harmony. Excessive noise pollution, namely, his rooster crowing before 8 a.m. Unauthorized livestock, goats, cows, and chickens, according to the HOA, weren't permitted under community guidelines. The final demand? That he cease and desist all non-compliant activities within 7 days, or face legal consequences. Jake laughed so hard, he nearly spilled his coffee. They were serious. And yet, they had no legal authority over his property. Instead of replying, he pinned the letter to his fridge like a hunting trophy and carried on with his day. But that was just the beginning. Within the week, things escalated further. County inspectors started showing up, health officials, zoning agents, even animal welfare reps. Someone, wonder who, had filed a string of complaints about health hazards on his farm. Each time, the inspectors arrived with clipboards and serious expressions. And each time, they left confused and empty-handed. The place was spotless. One of the inspectors, an older man named Roger, looked around the clean pens and neat pastures, then turned to Jake. "Son, I don't know who you upset, but they've got us running in circles. This is the cleanest farm I've seen in months." Jake chuckled. Wouldn't happen to be a certain HOA president filing these complaints, would it? Roger sighed. I can't say officially, but off the record? Yeah. Her name's on every single form. They shook hands, and Roger walked off, muttering something about entitled busybodies with too much time. But Karen wasn't done. Soon, Jake started finding handwritten complaints in his mailbox and signed, of course, but unmistakably in her passive-aggressive tone, "The smell of your farm is tanking our property values. Please be considerate. The sight of animals is distressing to children. Consider shielding them from view. A well-kept lawn is a sign of respect. Mow your fields or expect consequences." Jake had to admit he was almost impressed by the sheer pettiness. But then things went too far. One afternoon, while repairing an old section of his wooden fence, Jake heard the unmistakable roar of a chainsaw. It wasn't coming from his land. Frowning, he set down his tools and walked toward the sound, toward the property line that bordered the HOA. What he saw made his blood boil. A team of hired workers was putting up a fence on his land. A tall, ugly, steel-gray structure designed to block off any view of the farm. They had already cut into part of his property. And who was standing nearby with a clipboard, nodding smugly? Karen. Jake marched up, voice sharp. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen turned to him, wearing that fake smile. "Oh, Mr. Mitchell. Just making some community improvements. This new privacy fence will help preserve Crestwood's visual appeal." Jake pointed to the workers, who were now hesitating. "This fence is on my land." Karen's smile didn't fade. "Well, that's debatable," she replied sweetly. "The community reviewed some old survey maps. We believe your property line was drawn incorrectly. Since your land borders ours, it's in everyone's best interest to adjust things accordingly." Jake's fists clenched. They were literally trying to steal his land. "You believe the property line is wrong?" he repeated, voice low and cold. "Yes," Karen said, cool as ever. "And until we get clarification, we're moving forward with the project." Jake stepped forward, locking eyes with the workers. "You boys got a permit for this?" One of them stammered, the HOA told us they handled all the legal stuff." Jake smirked. "Well, they didn't. And unless you want to be charged with trespassing, I suggest you pack up right now." That was enough. The workers exchanged nervous looks, then quickly shut off the equipment and began packing. They clearly weren't getting paid enough to deal with this kind of mess. Karen, however, was furious. "You can't just order them to leave," she snapped. "This is a community project." Jake pulled out his phone and started dialing, making sure she could see the screen. "Then let's make it official. I'll let the sheriff sort it out." Karen's face went pale. "There's no need for that," she said stiffly. "Then I suggest you tell your crew to leave," Jake replied, his tone full of amused threat. With a glare that could cut glass, Karen gave the signal. The crew left. The project was dead before it even began. Jake wasn't done. That night, he dug out his property deed and found the official surveyor's map. He made copies, and by the next morning, he had mailed a cease and desist letter directly to the HOA board. The message was clear: step on his land again, and they'd be dealing with legal action. For a few days, it seemed like Karen had finally given up. But then came their next move. One morning, Jake woke up to find a massive for sale sign planted near the road, on his property. A second sign underneath read, "Under negotiation, coming soon, Crestwood Estates Phase 2." Jake stared at it, stunned. Then his anger surged. He stormed over, ripped the sign from the ground, and was just about to call the HOA office when Karen arrived. "Oh, good morning, Mr. Mitchell," she chirped with fake cheerfulness. "I see you've noticed the sign. There's been a little misunderstanding." "I'm sure," Jake said, folding his arms. "Well," Karen continued, her eyes gleaming, "we at the HOA have been in discussions about acquiring nearby properties for future expansion. Some real estate agents may have assumed your farm was included in the new Crestwood development, and the sign was placed a bit prematurely." Jake stared at her, incredulous. "You're telling me a real estate agency just accidentally planted a for sale sign on my land? Completely by mistake?" Karen's confident smile wavered slightly. "Well, maybe there was some excitement about the possibility," she said. Jake cut her off. "You're insane if you think you can just claim my land and hope I won't notice." Karen sighed dramatically, as if he were being the unreasonable one. "We just want to make the community a better place." Jake took a step forward. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call whoever put that sign up and tell them to never step foot on my property again. Because if I see one more sign, I won't just tear it down, I'll sue the entire HOA for fraud." Karen stiffened. "Now, Mr. Mitchell, let's not be hasty," Jake pulled out his phone. "I can also get the county involved, if you'd like." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. With an angry huff, she spun on her heel and stormed off. Jake shook his head as she left. He knew she wasn't done, but neither was he. Karen was relentless. If she couldn't force Jake to submit through legal pressure, baseless complaints, or even land grabs, she'd find other ways to cause chaos. But what she hadn't counted on was that Jake wasn't the kind of man who gave up. He wasn't just going to push back, he was going to make her regret every single step. The first thing he did was get ahead of her games. He went to the county records office and pulled every single document tied to his property, deeds, zoning approvals, land use permits. He made copies and kept them on hand, ready to shove proof in Karen's face the next time she tried anything. Then Jake went on the offensive. He called Sheriff Tom Caldwell, an old family friend, and laid out the entire situation. Tom had already heard about the bogus complaints, but this? "She tried to build a fence on your land and posted a for sale sign?" the sheriff asked, stunned. "Yep," Jake replied. "And I've got the paperwork to prove it." Tom sighed. "All right. If she or her people so much as cross the line again, you let me know. I'll make sure they get the message, loud and clear." With backup secured, Jake set his sights on some good old-fashioned petty revenge. Karen had complained about the rooster? Fine. He bought 3 more. Every morning, starting at 5 a.m. sharp, the chorus of crowing echoed straight into Crestwood Estates. Next, the ugly fields Karen had mocked? Jake planted sunflowers, an entire wall of them, lining the property boundary. Now, instead of looking at unkept farmland, the HOA was greeted by a towering, bright yellow barrier. And then came his masterpiece. Jake called Mason, a friend who ran the local farmers market, and proposed an idea, a weekly public event hosted right on Jake's land. It would be loud. It would be legal. And best of all, it would drive Karen insane. That weekend, flyers went up, Farmers Fun Day, free entry. Meet the animals, enjoy fresh produce, live music, family fun. The turnout was massive. Kids were petting goats. Parents were buying eggs and milk. Local musicians played country music. Laughter, clapping, and stomping boots filled the air. It was an absolute nightmare for Karen. And of course, she showed up. "This is completely unacceptable," she shrieked, waving her clipboard like it was a sword. "You can't just turn your farm into a carnival." Jake, grinning, crossed his arms. "Oh, but I can. I checked the county laws. My land is fully zoned for agritourism." Karen's eye twitched. "But the noise, the parking, all legal. County approved. And as you can see," Jake gestured toward the happy families, "people love it. In fact, I'm thinking of making it weekly. Maybe even expand to a full market." Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again. She looked like she might explode. With no argument left, she turned and stormed off, muttering something about bringing it to the board. But she wasn't finished, and neither was Jake. The next escalation was downright dirty. He began noticing strange cars parked near the road at odd hours. Then he spotted it, a drone flying over his property. Karen had actually hired a private investigator. Jake caught the guy snooping just outside the fence, snapping photos. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jake called out. The man froze. "Just, looking into a property dispute." Jake snorted. "Well, you can look from over there. This is private property." Later that night, Jake received yet another HOA letter, this time accusing him of unsanitary animal conditions and possible zoning infractions. He'd had enough. He called his lawyer, had a cease and desist order drafted, and marched straight into the next HOA board meeting, uninvited. Karen was in the middle of lecturing the room when Jake walked in. Gasps filled the air. He wasn't a resident, he wasn't allowed to be there. But Jake didn't care. He marched to the front, dropped a stack of legal documents on the table, and crossed his arms. "You've harassed me. You've trespassed on my land. You've filed false complaints and even sent people to spy on me." Karen turned red. "That's a ridiculous accusation." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "Because I have security footage of your investigator snooping, and this," he pointed at the paperwork, "is an official legal notice. If you don't back off immediately, I'll be suing not just the HOA, but you personally." The room went dead silent. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Clearly, not everyone was on board with Karen's crusade. One older woman cleared her throat. "Karen, maybe we should just let this go. He's not part of the HOA." Karen's face turned purple with rage. "He's disrupting the community." Jake cut her off. "You're just a control freak who doesn't know when to stop." Before she could fire back, the HOA president, a quiet older man named Richard, finally spoke up. "I think Mr. Mitchell is right," Richard said, flipping through the papers Jake had handed over. "The HOA has no jurisdiction over his farm. And if he's prepared to take legal action, we should rethink our approach." Karen gaped at him. "You can't be serious." Richard sighed. "You've done good work in the past, Karen, but I think you've taken this too far." That was the beginning of the end. Over the next week, half the HOA board turned against Karen. Some members resigned. Others publicly apologized to Jake. Then came the final blow. Richard called for an emergency vote. Karen was officially removed from her position. Jake didn't even have to lift a finger. The neighborhood was tired of her power trips. And once she lost control, the whole HOA began to crumble. 1 week later, Karen's house went up for sale. Rumor had it she'd been pressured to leave by the very neighbors she once tried to control. Jake couldn't have asked for a better ending. A few months later, Jake expanded his farm business and turned his weekend farmers market into a thriving local event. He never heard from the HOA again. And just to make the message crystal clear, he had a brand new sign made and placed it right at the edge of his property. It read, "Welcome to Mitchell Farms, HOA free since 1923. It quickly became a town landmark. Karen may have started the war. But Jake? Jake finished it. Word of the feud spread like wildfire. Soon, the entire town was buzzing about the standoff between the stubborn farmer and the overzealous HOA dictator. What began as a personal dispute had exploded into full-blown community drama, with Crestwood Estates caught squarely in the middle. At first, some HOA members rallied behind Karen. These were the rule-obsessed types, the kind of people who measured their grass with a ruler, reported kids for riding bikes, and lived for the thrill of writing passive-aggressive complaint letters. To them, Jake's farm was an eyesore that disrupted their perfectly manicured paradise. They genuinely believed property values mattered more than a man's right to live in peace on his own land. Then there were the neutral homeowners, people who just wanted to barbecue in their backyards without getting fined for unauthorized smoke. They had no beef with Jake. The farm had always been there. It wasn't hurting anyone. To them, this whole situation was just high-quality entertainment, like a live-action reality show, complete with Karen's tantrums and Jake's brilliantly petty revenge. And then came Jake's unexpected allies, the HOA rebels. These were residents who had silently suffered under Karen's reign for years, fined for Christmas lights left up one day too long, punished for chalk drawings on their sidewalks, or lectured over mailbox heights. Jake's fight became their symbol of resistance. One of the first to reach out was Linda Matthews, a longtime Crestwood resident who'd once been forced off the HOA board by Karen herself. One afternoon, she walked up to Jake's porch carrying a freshly baked apple pie. "You don't know it yet, Jake," she said with a smirk, "but you're doing God's work." Jake raised an eyebrow. Didn't think HOA folks were the pie-gifting type. Linda snorted. "Please. Not all of us are lunatics. You think I enjoy getting fined because my grandkids drew hopscotch on the driveway?" She shook her head. "I want Karen gone. And I'm not the only one." She wasn't kidding. More and more neighbors started showing quiet support. They couldn't defy Karen publicly, she still held power, but they started leaking inside information. That's how Jake found out the real truth. One evening, Greg, a retired veteran and one of the HOA rebels, showed up with a manila folder and a mischievous grin. "You're gonna love this," he said, sliding the folder across Jake's porch table. Inside were copies of internal HOA emails. "Karen's been submitting fake complaints," Greg explained. "She knew the county would stop listening if it was just the HOA filing everything. So she made up resident names and padded the numbers." Jake whistled. "That's bold." "Oh, it gets better," Greg said. "She also tried to push through a special assessment, a one-time fee every resident would have to pay. She wanted to use HOA funds to legally fight you." Jake laughed. "She actually tried to make them pay for her personal vendetta?" "She tried," Greg grinned. "Didn't go over well." Indeed, the tide was turning. Even some of the stricter HOA members were growing tired of Karen's obsession. They began asking why so much time, energy, and money was being spent attacking a farmer who didn't even live in their community. Meanwhile, the town had taken notice. Jake's war with the HOA had become the top topic in every coffee shop, Facebook group, and diner booth. The local paper ran a story. The town's Facebook group exploded with memes and updates. "I don't even live in Crestwood, but I hope the farmer wins. HOA people are the worst. She tried to annex a farm. That's unhinged. I'd watch the reality show version of this. Even Maggie's Cafe got in on it. The waitress renamed items on the menu: the Karen special, dry chicken sandwich with unsalted fries. The Jake burger, fully loaded with extra bacon. Karen was furious. Her power was slipping fast. Desperate, she tried one last power move. One morning, Jake woke up to find private community and no trespassing signs posted along every road leading to his property. The HOA had actually tried to claim the public roads as their own. Jake just shook his head. It was laughable. A few phone calls later, a county official showed up, furious. Not only was the HOA completely out of line, but Karen had already been on the county's radar for excessive complaints. The signs were taken down by sunset. And Karen? She got an official warning for trying to interfere with public access. Strike 3. That night, Linda texted Jake, "It's happening. They're voting to remove her." A few hours later, she's out. It's over. Karen was officially done. The very next morning, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn. The rumors were true. She was quietly being forced out by the people she used to control. Jake didn't even need to attend the meeting. He just sat on his porch, sipping coffee, listening to the roosters, and enjoying the peace. Karen's downfall wasn't sudden. It was a slow, spectacular collapse, one that exposed her as a power-hungry fraud. She had ruled with fear. But the second people stopped being afraid, they turned on her. Once it started, it was like watching a dam break. The final meeting was standing room only. Homeowners who never bothered to show up were eager to watch the drama unfold. Richard, the HOA president, stepped to the front of the room. "Let's get to the point," he said. "We've received formal complaints about misuse of HOA resources, unauthorized actions, and potential legal liability, all stemming from Karen's personal crusade against a property outside our jurisdiction." Karen scoffed, still clinging to her throne. "I've done nothing but protect this community." That's when Greg stood up. "Bull. You've bullied a man who had nothing to do with us, tried to spend our money on your vendetta, and you got caught." Linda followed up. "Let's not forget the fake complaints. The illegal fencing. The private investigator. Enough is enough." Karen, trembling with rage, tried to push back. But then Richard raised a folder. "This is a legal cease and desist from Jake Mitchell. And a warning from the county. If we don't take action now, this HOA is going to get sued." That was it. The vote happened on the spot. Karen was removed. Stripped of her power. Stripped of her title. Richard handed her the official notice. "As of tonight, you are no longer authorized to act on behalf of this HOA. And Karen, you might want to put your house on the market. No one here wants you around." The next morning, the moving truck arrived. Karen wasn't just leaving Crestwood, she was leaving town altogether. But Jake had one more message for her. That same afternoon, he placed a brand new sign facing the HOA: "Welcome to Mitchell Farms, no HOAs. No Karens. No problem." It became a local attraction. People took selfies with it. Shared it online. It was the perfect ending. 2 weeks later, Karen was gone. And with her, so was the fear. Crestwood changed almost overnight. Yards blossomed with personality. Kids rode bikes again. People stopped panicking over trash bins and garden gnomes. Jake? He was thriving. The HOA, now under new leadership, sent him a formal apology letter. He framed it and hung it right next to Karen's infamous cease and desist. Poetic justice. And just when he thought it was over, Linda and the other former rebels showed up at his door with a basket of baked goods. "Consider this a proper apology," Linda said, handing over a homemade pecan pie. Jake smirked. "An HOA offering peace? Didn't think I'd live to see the day." Linda chuckled. "Let's just say things are different now." One of the others scratched his head. "Honestly, Jake, most of us never had a problem with your farm. We were just afraid of ending up on Karen's bad side." "Fair enough," Jake said, biting into the pie. "Just don't try to annex my land again, and we're good." Everyone laughed. And just like that, years of tension began to fade. But karma wasn't quite finished with Karen. A few weeks later, word got around that she had moved to another HOA-run neighborhood, hoping to start fresh. But what she didn't know was that this HOA already had a president. A woman just as strict and power-hungry as she had been. Within a month, Karen found herself on the receiving end of everything she once dished out. Reported for her grass being too high. Fined for parking too close to the curb. Shut down when she tried to volunteer for leadership. By the time Jake heard the story, Karen had already listed her new home for sale, again. Poetic justice, indeed. Meanwhile, Mitchell Farms thrived. The weekend market had grown into a full-blown town event. Families came from miles away. Even former HOA members became regulars, buying eggs, vegetables, and jam from the very farm Karen tried to destroy. Jake never saw her again. But every now and then, sitting on his porch with a warm mug of coffee, he'd glance at that sign, "No HOAs. No Karens. No problem." And he'd smile. Because in the end, karma had done exactly what it was supposed to.